have the pleasure of talking about drug prices in more depth, which of course is such a controversial issue. I was listening to the news this morning and I heard them say that Martin Shkreli, whose name I always mispronounce, but who I know everyone in this audience is aware of, the former CEO of Turing, was auctioning off the opportunity to punch him in the face. And it just can't be that that's the solution to drug pricing. But sometimes it feels that way. What's the bid? I know. Do I have 100? But with this session, I really hope to get into the weeds. I think that everyone feels that there's something wrong here in how drugs are currently being priced, particularly in oncology. But the real question is what we do about that. And we heard somebody from Amgen talk about the need to move to value-based care. There's huge controversy over what that means, how that might be deployed, particularly in public programs. So Dr. Bach, we've spoken a lot in the past, and I'd love to hear from you just to start out, what's different now versus before? So back more than 10 years ago, people were writing articles about the high price of Avastin. We're still having the same conversation today. So are we at a point where you think there might be more broad change in thinking about value in cancer?
I think we probably are there. And ironically, it's in part driven by the launch of a drug not in cancer, Harvoni or Sovaldi, the treatments for hepatitis C, and Martin Shkreli, which had nothing to do with cancer, and Mylan, and other sort of crystallizing moments that have raised substantive questions about pricing practices in the pharmaceutical industry. But it's also, you're right, 10 years ago people were writing about Avastin and just sort of saying, gee whiz. And over the last decade, a number of things have become clear. One is that, probably not through intention, but the consequence of numerous legislative and regulatory actions in the US have led to there being no natural binding mechanism on the prices of cancer drugs and other drugs that are considered life-saving. Medicare and private payers have to pay for every cancer drug. If it's an infused drug, they have to pay based on what the manufacturer chooses to charge. If you're a Part D plan, the plans for prescription drugs in Medicare, you have to have every cancer drug on your formulary. Most states require that if you want to sell insurance in those states, the Affordable Care Act exchanges as well, you've got to have the cancer drugs. And once you have buyers who are mandatory buyers, you see what happens, right? And what we've had is double-digit inflation in launch prices with a background of double-digit inflation on existing drug prices in cancer and other specialty areas. And we've been able to start to unwind that and ask questions like, well, we don't know what a broken market looks like exactly. We don't know what the price is exactly, but we do know how prices should behave. And we can see clearly that they don't. So, and Josh just mentioned it, we had work demonstrating that if you look, adjusting for inflation, the cost of a cancer drug at launch for the number of life years it delivers has risen 5-fold in the last 20 years, adjusted for inflation. So it's not clear if the price was right back then or the price is right now, but for sure they both can't be true, right? And we have sort of a series of studies looking at this dissociation. And Lowell is here. You're going to hear about value frameworks. Lowell spearheaded the work at ASCO. I developed this drug abacus. I'm sure we'll talk about the American Heart Association, NCCN. Other organizations, ICER, have stepped forward with these value frameworks. And you have to understand, these didn't come up because somebody called all of us and said, we need value frameworks. Came up because of the clear dissociation between the benefits of drugs and the price. And that created essentially a market need for a way to look at these two pieces of the puzzle, the price and what the drug did, and try and reconcile them. And I think that market need is a product of just overwhelming clarity that these two things are not traveling together.
And I just want to highlight one point that you just made, because I think it's worth sort of elucidating clearly for the audience, which is that in America, contrary to in Europe, where they have very clear health technology assessment, which is controversial in its own right, and people in America often argue limits access to drugs. There's the sense that in America we have more of a private-based, market-based system, and what you just explained is a market that doesn't function because of regulations that we've layered on top of it. So there's no way to have market-based drug pricing in the context of American regulation. Is that correct?
I think that's fair. I mean, I always recoil when people talk about the market as if there's one, or as if markets achieve the goals that we have in healthcare, because I took exactly one econ class, which I got a B in. But the question I got right is what supply and demand in the normal function is supposed to accomplish. And it's supposed to accomplish two things, one that's good and one that's horrible when you think about drugs for life-threatening illnesses. The thing it achieves is it finds the market clearing price at the intersection. The other thing it achieves is that not everybody gets the product. That's how markets work. And that's not what we want in cancer. We want a system where people with diseases that could benefit from the drugs get the drugs. And so it is by definition not something that should be solved by markets.
Dr. Schnipper, moving to you, how have you been thinking about this at ASCO? You've been at this for a while now, thinking about what value in cancer might look like and have developed a framework. So what are the elements underpinning that?
Sure. The Value in Cancer Task Force actually didn't initially start off purely focusing on drugs, although I'll mention why we shifted in that direction momentarily. But it was pretty clear when the cost of healthcare in the country was absolutely out of control. We were also rather obviously but introspectively aware that our profession wasn't coming forward with solutions to the problem. Doctors were essentially buying and billing chemotherapy agents. That was mentioned in an earlier session as really an unfortunate bias towards high-cost drugs. But it's far more than that. We initially tackled the issue of doctors doing too much in conjunction with the American Board of Internal Medicine and the Consumer Reports. We participated and actually were one of the lead organizations in Choosing Wisely, which essentially is an evidence-based declaration of a number of common practices that we docs participate in quite regularly that bear no fruit for our patients but cost tons of money. And in fact, if there were uptake of many of these across all medical specialties, I'm sure we would begin to see an impact on the cost curve. But having said that, we were also quite aware that many of our patients are confronting huge economic consequences for having the shipwreck of cancer come front and center in their lives. And we thought the best thing to do was to kind of look at the oncologic drugs, because those are the ones that we prescribe when our patients come to us for help, and try to actually find a rational, evidence-based way of ascertaining their value to the patient. I think the fundamental premise we're operating on is that you should get what you pay for. If you basically want a Honda because it's a practical, useful car, or if you want a Jaguar because it's not such a practical but a lovely car, you darn well expect to pay different amounts for that, and you expect to get the appropriate quality, i.e. the value for the dollar you're spending. We're painfully aware that while there's huge amounts of excitement, and I can assure you, we docs who've been in this business for a long time are exceptionally excited about the prospects for the future. On the other hand, cancer progress has been very incremental. There have been a few home runs, but in baseball parlance, a lot of the progress that we actually talk about and see is more like singles and doubles. So how do we discern differences? We elected to essentially try to put together a framework that's built upon the parameters that we normally rely on for the evidence base that we docs use to prescribe drugs to patients. That means clinical benefit in its various manifestations, and we try to quantify that for agents that are tested in a randomized trial. Similarly, we know that cancer drugs are not a free pass from the point of view of physical side effects, harmful side effects, and so we in fact elected in our framework to weigh these and either add or detract points based upon a new innovative regimen's degree of toxicity. Is it less? Is it more? And impact the score accordingly. And then there are a number of very patient-specific issues that we felt were important to factor in when we think about how valuable a drug is at a clinical level. And that is, of course, how long does the patient survive with the disease? But how does it make them feel? If they're very sick with advanced cancer, does it relieve their symptoms? Is the quality of their life improved or not, et cetera? And we jumbled these up and essentially came up with a net health benefit. And that's as far as we went in a quantifiable assessment of drugs. But we felt that we couldn't, in this day and age, talk to our patients in good faith, knowing that they're going to be confronted with some cost sharing, depending on the type insurance plan they have, let alone have the doc and the patient unaware of the huge cost implications of the therapies we're using. And so we also decided to add into our framework a visible depiction of cost of administering the cancer, purchasing the cancer drug, and the supportive care drugs needed to implement it, as well as in a patient-by-patient way, based on their insurance plan, what their out-of-pocket costs would be. Why do we do it that way? Because step one in our thinking was, let's deal with what the patient is dealing with and help them discern what to them might become real value versus questionable value versus a trade-off that they may be forced to make regarding paying mortgage payments or kids' college tuitions, et cetera. So I think I'll stop there, and I'm happy to amplify as the discussion evolves, but that's the basic tool that we came up with, and we identified a number of clinical trials, primarily using them as examples of how the framework would operate in either the very advanced cancer setting or the early and therefore potentially curative cancer setting. Happy to discuss that as the morning evolves.
So, Dr. Schnipper, just to follow up quickly, I think the natural next question is how this is deployed on a patient-by-patient basis, given, as we know, that different patients react to different drugs in a unique way, and also that their priorities around cost or side effects might vary. So since the introduction of the framework, what sort of feedback have you heard about how this is deployed?
Oh, we've heard a lot of feedback. I've been in the crosshairs of a lot of biotechnology companies, I think. But in fact, I celebrate innovation and would want to do nothing to impede real innovation. But for example, in non-small cell lung cancer, when we put it to the test, there is a drug, bevacizumab, many of you are familiar with, added to chemotherapy. A clinical trial that was considered credible by the entire profession indicated that there, as a result of the Avastin, there was an improvement median for 50% of the population of about 2 months overall survival at a cost that compared standard chemotherapy of about $300 a month to the Avastin plus chemotherapy of about $11,000 or $10,000 a month. Now, I'm not the patient, and therefore I'm not really in a position to sort of say, this is what you must do, but I certainly think that for many patients who are living far closer to the margin than many others, they need to think about whether that 2-month advantage that one might predict to them is worth an enormous impact on their family. It's basically that kind of thing. When we have therapies that are absolute winner on the one hand and not so good on the other, it seems obvious, regardless of the cost, we need to provide that for our patient. When the call is close, and I can assure you in the oncology sphere, the call is close between one drug and another, we need to have a mechanism for patients to understand what it is they're getting, and that we, as payers, as patients, should expect to pay for what it is that we're getting. If we're getting very little or nothing, frankly, I don't think we should pay for that product. That's really the principle on which we're operating.
So, Dr. Miller, you're the Chief Medical Officer for the biggest PBM, and you've been thinking about this across the range of therapies that are covered by Express Scripts, but particularly for cancer, it's a thorny issue because of the diversity across patients. So how have you been thinking about how you can use the tools at your disposal to provide value to patients in cancer?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So as you know, people have been talking about value-based reimbursement. Most people haven't been able to get to it. We actually have taken Peter's ideas and other ideas and actually have implemented them already. And so right now, when people talk about outcomes-based reimbursement, so the example you heard earlier today was Tarceva, it's really hard to get there because our systems don't support that today. But that doesn't mean you can't do value-based contracting today. So let me give you some examples. We have done indication-based reimbursement as Peter had suggested, but in a very practical way. So there's a couple of things you have to remember. If you have Tarceva for lung cancer and you want to pay a premium price, but for pancreatic cancer it doesn't work as well, you want to pay a lower price, that would actually destroy best price for the manufacturer. So you actually can't do that. So what we do is we contract with the manufacturers on a blended rate. We've been able to do this in renal cancer, non-small cell lung cancer and prostate cancer already today. And we do unique contracts with the different pharmaceutical manufacturers, so they're actually sharing the risk. The best example is a drug, Iressa, for lung cancer. AstraZeneca did a contract with us because they know that with our specialized care model, where we have specialist pharmacists in cancer, nurses and social workers, we're able to keep patients on these first-line therapies for a longer period of time. This is actually crucial because first-line therapy is first-line therapy because it has better outcomes. They made a deal with us. If a patient goes on Iressa and in the first month they either don't see the response they want or the patient has side effects, we refund 100% of the money back to the plan sponsor. So the patient can essentially try Iressa risk-free. The oncologists like it because there's been no narrowing. They have all the drugs still available to them. They just understand that if they try Iressa, it's going to be risk-free to the patient. This is value-based contracting because I'm already getting an incredibly good price on the drug, but this is value above and beyond the unit cost. We just announced that in rheumatoid arthritis, we're doing the exact same thing. So we're doing indication-based pricing. So we're reimbursing the pharmaceutical companies different for rheumatoid arthritis versus psoriasis versus ankylosing spondylitis, because those drugs work differently in those conditions. And in that particular case, if the patient doesn't stay on the drug or has toxicity in the first 3 months, they're going to refund 2/3 of the money. At the average cost of $3,000 a month, that means you could get a refund of up to $6,000 if you don't stay on that drug for 3 months. Again, it's value-based contracting, so we can do it today, but we have to be innovative in how we do it. It has to work for the pharmaceutical manufacturer, it has to work for the payer, and it has to work for the patient, and also for the physician.
So those are four entities whose interests are not always aligned, but is there a limit to the type of drugs with which you can do that type of value-based contracting as you just described? Does it only apply to certain types of treatments? Are there some categories where it just wouldn't be applicable?
Yeah, so I will be very frank. Oncology is the very hardest to do. The reality of the study, so you all understand what we did with hepatitis C and creating the price war with hepatitis C. It's because I had 2 drugs that had a bimodal outcome, cure, no cure. And so in those particular cases, I could find 2 drugs that worked identically, and I could pit them against each other, and we could create a price war. In cancer, because of the nature of the studies, and remember the pharmaceutical companies design their studies, there are never like populations being studied. And so I can never pit one drug against another because there's always a slight difference in the population that they're studying, intentionally. And so the reality is when it comes to value-based contracting for oncology, while we're dipping our toe in it, we've had some success, we're not going to have the breakthroughs that we are having in other diseases. And remember, our goal is to get to a sustainable marketplace. And when I say sustainable, I want innovation. I want the United States to continue to be the innovator when it comes to pharmaceuticals. But we have to balance that with access and affordability. Those two go hand in hand. And so we currently are out of balance. We don't have pharmaceutical manufacturer leadership that has obeyed the social contract. In the past, the leaders of these companies would say, even when I have a monopoly, I'm not going to gouge. But what we see now, the Mylan episode, the Daraprim episode, and sometimes even in oncology, is they're taking advantage of this social contract. They're taking advantage of the market that Peter talks about where you can't limit choice, and they're gouging. And that you cannot regulate that out of existence. You need better leadership.
So I guess thinking about the debate that we all saw on Monday night, drug pricing didn't come up. I wonder whether it will come up in future debates, but that's an area where Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton superficially agree, where they both have said that they support Medicare negotiating the price. Now, I think many people in this room would recognize that a simple negotiation on that level isn't going to be particularly effective, but in Medicare, which is the biggest area of profits for pharmaceutical company and where so many oncology patients are getting coverage, how do you see some of the principles as you've outlined them potentially being applied? They're not at all applied now. I mean, perhaps you could talk a little bit about the Medicare Advantage market to start, but how does this conversation play out in Medicare?
Yeah, so, and Peter's more of an expert in this than I am, but the reality is this. If you can't move market share, if you can't narrow a formulary, the pharmaceutical companies have no incentive to give you a better price. And so if you just say the government, the same people that negotiates for hammers and toilet seats that do today, are going to get a better price because they're better negotiators, I think that's a big fallacy. And so you have to be willing to narrow your formulary. The reason the VA gets great price is because the VA has one beta blocker on the formulary. And if you move all your market share to that one beta blocker, the pharmaceutical companies will give you a great price. But as Peter said, if I have to make every cancer drug available, then there's no way they have any incentive to give you a better price. So just changing the negotiator to the same person that negotiates hammers for the Department of Defense is not going to get us to better prices. You have to change the regulations that allow some flexibility on utilization management.
And so even if you could remove those 6 protected classes, of which cancer is one of them for Medicare, is that the right answer? Do you think that that should be what happens, or is there a different alternative that might be a better solution? Perhaps Dr. Bach, you could speak about this.
Sure, I'm still laughing about the hammers. I'm sure they know where every one of those hammers is, right? All right, so without getting too in the weeds, Medicare's 2 separate drug systems. There's the medical benefit, infused drugs like bevacizumab, and pills like Iressa, actually. So on the medical benefit side, the law says, and neither candidate has made any mention of this, the law says that the payment from Medicare is the average sales price the manufacturer charges, net of rebates and discounts and stuff. And nobody's talked about interfering with that except the Medicare program itself through this Part B pilot, which showed up, I think, on Amitabh's slide earlier this morning. And Medicare actually has put forward, under their own authority given to them by the Affordable Care Act, to actually start doing things in the Part B side. Reference pricing, value-based pricing, indication-specific pricing, things that would, and also taking away what Amitabh called the tip that doctors get paid for using, that rises as the cost of the drug rises because they get a proportional markup. And so there's movement there. Neither candidate has focused on it. It has become the target of intense lobbying from pharma, from doctors' groups, and actually from ASCO against the Medicare moving forward. So I think that battle will play out however it plays out politically. I've written quite a bit about why many of the scare tactics being used are not based in fact. On the D side, that's what the candidates are talking about, the pills. Non-interference was in the MMA, a Republican piece of legislation from 2003. And I think the idea that we've advanced, and I get the benefit, Lowell is in the real world, and Steve too. I am not. I sit in my office, I dream up things that'll never happen and put them on a website. But what I dreamt up was value-based pricing. And the idea was that, and we walked it through, and Steve Pearson from Eisner and I wrote a piece in JAMA where we explained, look, if you will, the magical solution here is not what ASCO has done, which is highly practical and takes into fact reality, which is that prices are what they are, but instead it's to find appropriate prices so that these other things naturally flow. And so a drug that provides a month of life with low toxicity is worth something. It just is probably not worth what's currently charged. And a drug that provides 12 months of life is also worth something. So we should seek to find those prices the same way HTA and the rest of the world already does. And then we should marry that to access. And we propose specifically that that's the way the Part D formulary requirements should flow rather than by protected classes. So cancer drugs that are appropriately priced should be on formulary with a $5 copay. And ones that aren't should have a larger, they could be tiered, they could have larger copay. And that's what I'd like to see happen. It would be a much more rational thing. And it's actually the opposite of negotiation. It's, HTA-driven price finding.
And so what are the prospects, in your opinion, of that taking off? Have you heard anything from members of Congress?
It'll happen right after Donald Trump releases his tax returns. No, it's... I think the question is, are we at a moment now where something big could happen like that? Could we have pilots on D? I think we actually might be at a moment where such things are achievable, at least in small pilot testing. And as Steve has pointed out, the private sector has really led the way every single time here. And so I would actually expect things like this to emerge from Express or CVS long before Medicare implements something. But they have D plans that they could run them through as well. So I think we will see tests of this idea, and hopefully there'll be careful monitoring of access for patients, and hopefully, some data will actually drive policy.
Dr. Schnipper, in Medicare, how do you see, is your framework applicable there? How do you see what you're doing intersecting with possible reform in Medicare?
Our framework is, as I mentioned earlier, focused for the moment on drugs, but a much larger initiative that ASCO is undertaking, it really sees drugs as just one part of it. And yes, drugs need to be, I think, priced by indication and valued by indication and their outcome. But the society has also put together sort of an initiative on value in cancer care writ large, because I think the discussion does need to be well beyond drugs. It needs to be about cost offsets. When you really have a drug that's a super valuable commodity, it will be so because it not only reduces suffering, but extends economic value throughout the society. So we're trying to come up with a framework, if you will, that is adaptable to much more than drugs, and we're not quite there yet. So as an in-between step, the society has actually had a number of discussions with CMMS about literally trying a bundled payment approach, to begin to look at a bundled payment, a so-called episode of care, if you will, and roll together treatment of advanced lung cancer, first-line therapy, but roll it together in its entirety and go through the real world at the moment for what it actually is costing payers, patients, to deliver such care, and physicians and their physician extenders in their offices, and begin to make a proposition for pilot projects to do just that. It's a little bit like the United Healthcare concept, but we think that that's very likely to be part of the future, where assessments of value for not just, it might well be hospital care on the one hand, which we're going to start grading in a much more rigorous way than we are now, but value assessments for drugs, for the quality of care we're delivering, and have that come under a particular sort of cost envelope, if you will, with rewards if in fact targets are met, and probably disincentives if they're not.
This conversation about value, do you see it filtering through back through R&D, where you see drug companies being more focused on presenting economic data, perhaps to you, Dr. Miller, to show how a certain drug might lower the cost of care down the road? Do you see any shift in the type of data that you're presented with that is both clinical and economic?
Yeah, so the good news of this debate, and Peter identified it, really goes back to the introduction to hepatitis products, is that the pharmaceutical manufacturers are reaching out to the payers way more often now, and we're having better discussions about what kind of data are we going to need to help in the marketplace. And so I think it is reaching all the way back into their pipelines, understanding what these products are going to be able to do. We provide them information, which is essentially the real world data. How long do patients actually stay on their products? What do they switch to when they go off it? How many people are actually adhering to protocols? What's really frightening is the low number of physicians. So you can have all these great protocols, but the number of physicians that actually are staying on protocol is frightfully low, and it's not just in cancer, it's across all the diseases. And it's been shown that the patients that do stay on the protocols actually have better survival and lower costs. And so working with them so that we can create support systems from the introduction of the drug, so it's used appropriately, I think is really important, and they're much more motivated today than they were several years ago.
My name is David Ortiz. I played for, she did get a joke. I'm Bob Goldberg, Center for Medicine and the Public Interest. My question is for Dr. Miller. Actually, two questions. My daughter is pregnant. I'm going to be his 80, very happy to announce. But she has morning sickness. She only responds to Diglegis, Express Scriptus, or PBM. You don't cover it. She has to pay out of pocket. Second question. To what extent can you tell us whether or not you pass the rebates that you generate directly to the patients who are on the highest cost-sharing tiers that are part of the system? From an outsider, it seems like a very rigged system where you're maximizing profit at the expense of patients. So when you take a hepatitis C drug and sure that you launched it at a price lower than in Europe, but people are still paying in the highest cost sharing tier and having to sue. I mean, what can you say to those kind of responses? And by the way, can I give you my daughter's prescription at the end of the conference?
So the answer is yes for your daughter. There's actually medical exceptions. So her physician, working with her physician, they can often get a medical exception if appropriate. The other questions, though, besides the family issues, are this, and that is when you look at rebates. So we went from a model in the past where we had rebates where people were switching patients from brand to brand. Then we went to a model of generics, and the generic model was actually the best because it was clearly you were at a very high price drug, you moved the patient to a generic, the patient paid a lower copay, the plan paid less, and the outcomes were the same. So that was all good. We're now back in an era of rebates. And why do we have rebates? It's because the pharmaceutical manufacturers have to have a way to have variable drug pricing. So just like in any industry, if you buy huge volumes of something, you're going to get a bigger discount than if you don't buy huge volumes. Now, the big issue with rebates is where they go back to. We actually have some of our plans that actually want the rebates to go all the way back to the patient at the point of sale, and we have the capability of doing that, and we do it all the time. But most companies prefer the rebates to come back to them, and I'll explain why. So at Express Scripts, they get this pool of money back, and they can decide to subsidize premiums. The premiums for our lowest paid employees are the lowest, and the premiums for our highest paid employees are the highest. And the reason is that we don't peanut butter the rebate dollars. We specifically give it back to the low-income employees, and many companies choose to do this. So we can actually give the rebates all the way back. Most companies choose not to do it. Our percentage, as you know, the vast majority of the rebates flow all the way back to the plans. 90% of our plans are getting 100% of the rebates. And so while it's a great frustration because people don't see this money coming back, it's the plans that actually decide what to do with the rebate funds. Is this a perfect system? And the answer is absolutely not. I believe there has to be safety for patients. What do I mean by that? I think we need to have copay caps. The trouble with high deductible health plans is they're actually designed for rich people and sold to poor people. And it will always be that way. The average person just can't come up with a couple $1,000s cash. And so what happens is we sell these plans to poor people because they look affordable, but they're one illness away from being bankrupt. Mm-hmm. And so the reality is that we need to cap it. So we need to say no one should ever pay more than $250 out of pocket for any fill or something. I don't know what the exact number is. Our data shows that non-adherence really skyrockets above $250. So I know it has to be $250 or somewhere south of there, because we have to put guardrails around this if we're going to have this kind of what's called insurance. Because for many patients, this actually isn't insurance. It's just a disaster waiting to happen.
Yes, the gentleman back there.
Yeah, my name's Dennis Morgan. I'm a medical oncologist. And every patient who gets chemotherapy signs a consent form. And we talk about risk-benefit analysis a bit. We tell them there's no guarantee the drug will work. We tell them for mostly legal reasons it might kill you. Do you think we should be discussing financial toxicity? Because bankruptcy is an all too common side effect of chemotherapy.
So that is a well-timed question. As you probably are aware, there's quite a lot in the literature now about financial toxicity as a parallel form of a negative impact of cancer treatment along with the physical toxicities. And I think that institutionally, ASCO feels that it is very important for our patients to become aware of what the implications are of our recommendations to them regarding their finances as well as their health. And that's actually why we set the value framework up initially as a patient-doctor shared decision-making tool. Here's how good it'll be compared with other regimens that are that are available to us, and here's how much you will pay for it out of pocket. I think that becomes a very, very likely scenario as patients become more and more stressed by the healthcare costs they confront. When you survey patients with metastatic cancer coming into an oncology clinic and ask them about price sensitivity, and do they want to actually get into this discussion, well more than half, probably 2/3 of them, actually want to hear this from their doctor or from the people in the office complex. This is not any longer a dirty, dark secret. This is something that has real world implications. The conversation that we're having now began with mention of a health technology assessment possibility or lack thereof, thinking about what goes on in other parts of the world. I actually would love to hear responses from the audience here to there being some sort of impartial body somewhere between the FDA and, let's say, Medicare that gives a scientifically based assessment of the clinical impact and value of new agents that come to be considered for commercialization. I can't help but think, while not being a dictatorial process, if an impartial process that's separate from sort of the doc's self-involved or the manufacturer, but something that we would all have representation on, gave us an assessment of where in today's world drug X, new innovation, fits, would that be helpful in beginning to shape how the drug is used and how much we're willing to pay for it?
Dr. Schnipper, isn't that called a death panel? I'm just kidding.
Wasn't meant that way.
But I actually am really curious about that as well. Maybe by a show of hands, I think people probably in the room are familiar with the idea of HTA. And who thinks that the idea of an impartial body, as Dr. Schnipper just described, if you raise your hand and think that's a bad idea? And how many people think it's a good idea?
Fall of
Lots of
2016,
nervous
lots of undecideds.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so we have a question from the app. Generic non-cancer drugs such as beta blockers add survival to existing therapies and add value. How do we get these drugs into practice? So I guess this is talking about the metabolism of cancer, perhaps, but the physicians on the panel would know better than I.
I am aware of some very provocative studies that speak to the issue of beta blockers that suggest that there is a positive benefit. My own understanding of the literature is that it is really a fascinating hypothesis, and there are other compounds that are similarly suggested as being additional value added to existing cancer therapy. I think this needs to be subjected to the way we basically make our scientifically based decisions, and that is a randomized trials. Otherwise, it really is just behaving in a one-off fashion, and there are going to be patients who are hurt by beta blockers. And so we really need to have a structured way of answering the question. To my knowledge, has not been a well-refereed prospective randomized trial. But it's an interesting concept.
There's yes, the woman right there. I think the microphone's right behind you.
Follow up to that question. We've tried to get funding for that sort of trial, and there's no funding because they're generics, and there's no pharma. The NIH or the NCI are not interested in funding that. So what's the solution? The preliminary studies exist. We just can't get them forward.
I'm sorry, Peter.
No, please.
There are a few initiatives that I'm aware of. I've been part of one or two that have failed. Basically, social entrepreneurship, if you will, of trying to basically repurpose established agents because there is some preliminary data that would suggest their utilization might be helpful to the patient. It's a real challenge, and I sympathize with the question. I don't have an answer, but I know that right now Mark Rattain has convened a group of people we've been meeting on a few occasions, and specifically that is the question. Can we develop an argument for going forward in a social entrepreneurial way to address questions like that?
Can I answer very briefly too? So this gets to issues of the drug development process that are in a way broken, that the most important potential innovations, I'm not saying it will necessarily pan out, but may not be the most attractive to the people with the most money. And so there's been quite a bit of talk about thinking about drug development as a series of processes with different kinds of incentives that don't necessarily interdigitate. And the most common discussion about it, and this is like social entrepreneurship, is prizes. So if you imagine that, ketorolac's another example, right, of a drug that's being heavily looked at in metastatic breast cancer. If you imagine that the reward, the prize, is a cash prize for, getting FDA approval for the indication or documenting at some level, it doesn't matter any longer that the long-term finances don't make sense because there's no IP. It just, you get the prize and society benefits. And so I think that a lot of people are talking about the drug development process as one that would be better suited to that sort of prize-type model where clearing the hurdle gets the reward to the early investors, and the next step doesn't involve a large pharma company buying the asset and tripling the price of it, which is what we have right now, to drive their own revenues.
So unfortunately, we're out of time. I know that this is a subject that could take up an entire conference in itself, but I'm so grateful to the three of you for joining us. I think that we've had sort of a glimpse into all of the many changes that are happening both within the private sector, among oncologists, and the experiments in Medicare. So the next few years will be very interesting to see how the experiments that are now underway continue to evolve, as well as what surprises Washington may hold for us when the next president takes office in January.